I'm here with Arsalan, who's our CTO. My name's Ali. I'm the founder of Aleph and Aleph Labs. What we're trying to do today is essentially talk through how we would design an AI workflow for a client, and hopefully there's something valuable for you to learn from that. So the specific case that we're dealing with today is for one of our clients who actually works in an industry that's not necessarily the sexiest industry with lots of opportunity for creating really fancy content, but rather they're in aviation fuels and fluids and greases. There's a lot of technical documentation that goes along with for each product, and that's a basis for the content to be created. But the brief was we need to find a way to take all of this technical documentation, take the strategy that we've created for them in terms of the content strategy, the SEO strategy, and then find or create a workflow that allows them to create content at scale that is consistent with the technical details in this technical documentation, but also provides the unique angle for the company, their tone of voice, their branding message, that sort of thing, to set them apart in the market. So, Salan, I think that is pretty much the brief that I gave you, correct?
That's exactly right. So, what we'll do today is we'll walk through the workflow that we have put together. We'll do a high level overview of all the technical components and talk about the design decisions that we've made about specifically where the solution pauses and asks for input, and then also just how much fidelity we've incorporated into this whole solution. So, if you think about the actual brief in terms of where we are with large language models, I think it's like one of the lowest hanging fruit is just to get it to write something. And the reason that this even exists as a problem statement right now is that, you know, these chat solutions like Gemini and ChatGPT, they're essentially over engineered to the point that they're meant to hold conversations really well. But I think where writing things consistently, where it consistently gets the same saved memory for an SEO strategy or for the kinds of keywords or the tone of voice that our client wants to use, it just becomes an overhead to undo some of the stuff that's happening under the hood when ChatGPT is in the picture. So I will walk through all the components, and then I'll point out exactly where we made those decisions about not over engineering this solution. So to start off, we implemented this whole thing on N8N, and N8N is essentially meant to be as a backend process, and the completed version of this solution will interact with either Teams or Slack. So all the output that we see on the screen is not meant to be shown on this interface. It's meant to be, on Slack or maybe even a Google document. So the logic sits in N8N, and it interfaces with a few external tools, the primary one of which is a database. And we're using a document database called MongoDB, which hopefully a lot of people will be familiar with. But if you aren't, it's essentially just a database that houses documents stored inside a collection. So our collection here specifically is called SEO Writer. And the solution relies on 4 specific documents. The first 2 are just we isolate these documents using a specific key called document type. So if you look closely, every single document has that same key. The first 2 documents are for storing the draft and the article. The second is called a writer state, and this stores our SEO strategy and our style guides. So as I was saying a moment ago, the way ChatGPT and Gemini are engineered, you don't really have control over what it consistently sees as memory. And you also don't know how they're engineering that memory. So there are often, things that'll get lost and you won't be aware that the model isn't seeing that information. So what we want to do is engineer a solution where the SEO strategy, the style guides, the templates that it's referring to are never lost. And that's really why we're doing this very, very simple implementation where N8N talks to MongoDB and it pulls this context every single time. So writer state stores that information. And then the last stuff we have here is a document called templates. The the production version of this solution contains, hopefully dozens and dozens of these templates, but for demonstration purposes here, we just have three. So the solution right now, it can produce a buying guide, a client case study, or a product comparison. And the idea again here is to just allow the user to save templates that really work with their brand guidelines and their website. So the solution will just be able to, dynamically pull this context, or I should say N8N will dynamically pull this context and inject it into the LLM node. And that'll just guarantee that the kind of output we're getting is, very close-ended, but except for the actual content itself. So the structure, the style, the SEO keywords, all of that is very tightly controlled and very consistent.
Okay.
The last thing I'll point out here before we, jump into the operation is that we're using a very simple orchestrator architecture. And an orchestrator architecture is basically just having one central agent that relies on other agents to perform very specific tasks. In this case, the specific tasks we have are, they're labeled down here. So we have one task where the orchestrator can update the database. So for example, we'll see very soon that the solution will ask a user to input an SEO strategy. And the orchestrator will just save that SEO strategy to MongoDB. And that's the only time they'll ever need to do that. They can also use the update database tool to update the style guides. And in the future, they'll also be able to use this to update templates. The second thing is a drafting tool. So it takes the user's input query, it takes in any links that they want to provide, any particulars about, how to set the title, really any kind of input that the user wants to provide. And that goes to the drafting tool, and that'll produce a short, not fully complete, draft ready for review. And then that draft, along with final comments and suggestions, are passed to the writing tool, which produces the final output. The drafting tool and the writing tool do save their output to MongoDB. So if at any point the tool loses context of what's happening, it can retrieve, the last draft or the last article using the retrieve output tool as well. So those are the core functionalities that the orchestrator relies on. Now, I will jump straight into just showing how this works. There are some, minor design choices here that we'll skip over, but actually I'll mention them really quick. So we're using Gemini. Gemini 2.5 is very good at writing, and I think the real reason for using it and the real reason for anybody to use Gemini in production is the latency is, just levels better than the competition. So without further ado, the input query is something as simple as, what we would want our end user to put in. So we don't want any onus on them to provide guidelines, provide templates. So the only thing they'll say is, I want to write an article on a Shell Asto 500, which is one of the products that our client stakeholders would potentially write. And the link is just a data sheet that contains information about Asto 500. Here we go. Now, the first thing the orchestrator does is it tries to formulate an input to the drafting tool. And one of the critical parts of that query is that the drafting tool requires one kind of template. So what the solution does is it actually goes to MongoDB and it retrieves the names of the templates that are saved. So in a future state where there might be 20 or 30 or even 50 templates in the solution, it'll just list them for the user, and the user just gets to choose one. If the user is aware of using the tool and they just enter the initial query with a template name, it'll just skip this step. But this is, the first pause point. So for this demo, let's just say buying guide. That's the one that we wanted to do. It'll go through the same process again. It'll just touch MongoDB, pass that to Gemini, and you can see that it's already jumped to the drafting tool. Now we're about to see a second pause point. So the drafting tool, again, pulls information from MongoDB, and it checks for two things. The two things are absolutely critical. The first is an SEO strategy present? So this solution is meant to be packaged with just the a blank like 4 blank documents on MongoDB, 3 blank documents on MongoDB, excuse me, and 1 document that contains templates. We do want the user to provide an SEO strategy and a style guide based on their own requirements. So our solution read MongoDB on that specific document, and it saw that the SEO strategy was blank. So the first thing it just does is that it says, I can't do anything yet. Give me an SEO strategy. Now we've gone ahead and we've prepared one here. So this is a sample SEO strategy that we created for our clients. So I'm just going to copy this into the prompt, and let's see what the solution does now. So immediately Gemini recognizes that we've passed in an SEO strategy, so it uses the update database tool. The update database tool then just returns a success flag that the SEO strategy is stored, and it repeats the previous query for the drafting tool. And so now let's see what the drafting tool returns. If it finds everything is complete, it'll give us a draft. If not, it might prompt us again for some information. Excellent. So we've gone through 2 pause points. Let's look at the third. So we put in a couple of default requirements that we thought that our client would need. So 2 of those default requirements are not part of the input query that we've given it so far. So it's asking us who the brand or supplier is, and then what unique differentiators are present. So why don't you give me a quick little answer for the second one? I've got the first one covered.
Yeah, I think it's actually some of the examples that it's given are quite relevant. Let's say authorized distributor status would be top, local technical support in the UAE, real-time inventory visibility, um, extensive stock. Honestly, they're all good.
Let's assess the draft. So this is straight from the drafting tool, and let's just say it's got a good strong heading. I think calling out the product name right there in the beginning, the definitive procurement guide for aviation professionals. Now, skimming through, I think it's done a pretty reasonable job based on the fact that we've looked at the SEO strategy and we know what the sections should be. I don't see anything that it might have missed out. A good strong section on, really highlighting Avio Pro. And then it ends with one call to action here. So this is really the last and final pause point that our client emphasized. And this is one of those things where, these feature requests come in based on how processes exist right now, and they're aware of the high cost of producing an article. So their suggestion was, maybe we should have a pause point where we get to provide feedback before the final article is complete. And so we've just mirrored that request in this workflow. But I think over time, given the fact that there is no cost, or there's very little cost to producing an end state like a final article that can be updated with feedback, we might just streamline the workflow to completely eliminate the drafting agent entirely. But for
I
now,
would,
just to look at what happens with the final agent, we should just say, we don't have any specific feedback.
yeah, just while that's executing, I would say I agree with your instinct when it comes to the drafting tool potentially becoming redundant. And it's because, again, Having run content departments before for agencies and different clients, as you said, one of the main reasons for having this in between step or a pause point in terms of we've ingested the brief for the article that the clients provided, we've reviewed all of the research, and then we've converted that into essentially an article outline, which is what you're showing here as an article draft. That used to be a very important checkpoint in completely human or manual content creation workflows, because what you don't want is a
Mm-hmm.
human writer to go down the wrong path and come back a week
Yeah.
later with a finished article that's in the wrong direction. In this case, as you said, the cost for changing an article is relatively insignificant compared to the cost for asking a client to review another piece of content,
Yeah.
i.e., the draft, before the final article. So that's the sort of toss up that we're doing between the two. And then when we're applying systems thinking to implementing any kind of AI workflow, those are some of the decisions that we have to make. So ultimately, our North Star is always what is the purpose of this system that we're creating or this subsystem that we're creating. The purpose of this subsystem is to create high quality content that positions Avio Pro as a unique and value adding supplier of these aviation products in the market and makes it very clear to their
Mm-hmm.
target audience why they should select them. And to do that in the most effective way possible. Every single decision that we've made along the way in terms of what parts to keep and what parts to eliminate are based on that. If we were to take more time from Avio Pro's subject matter experts to get them to review drafts, then I have a very strong feeling that they would probably push back and say, what's the whole point of AI automation if we're still having to do all of this work? Yeah.
That's exactly right. And, this is just one of those things I think that is important to do once to get buy-in. But once there is adoption and once they realize, that these specific pause points are not delivering the value that they thought they would, they might just update the request themselves. If not, we're always there to just, go and nudge them and suggest, maybe this workflow can be faster. Maybe, you can save a little bit of time here, a little bit of cost there. So as a final step for right now, I won't go through every single line of this, but it more or less follows the same structure that the draft provided, but every single section is now complete. All the bullet points are numbered correctly. Everything's emphasized where it needs to. The final step that I'll just do is I'll go to Mongo and I'll just refresh this just to show you what the state of the database looks like after using it once. And you can see here now that in the writer state, our SEO strategy contains the exact text that we put into the tool. So everything that we had on that PDF is now saved here. And we can, we're aware that the style passages maybe need to be updated. So we can always go back to N8N and say, update the style guide to, sound like a specific person. And that should be updated here. But because we now have this information saved in Mongo, in this dedicated database, essentially what we're highlighting is that, instead of trying to just do custom GPTs where you're wrestling with the system prompt that the OpenAI team has put in place for you, I think it's it's the right thing to do here is to just build these fit for purpose workflows where the prompt is very consistent and very specific to just one task. And that just guarantees, you know, very low frustration because the promise that your users have is that this tool just produces a good output as opposed to going to the tool and, I'm sure you've had those days where after a long, chain of frustrating outputs, you just say something like, "Can you write the way I want you to write?" Which adds absolutely no context. And I think just the over promise of what ChatGPT and what Gemini are supposed to do for these end users just gets to people where they don't understand how this seemingly sentient thing cannot understand a very simple command. And I think these, built for purpose workflows are the right way to engineer these solutions, both for cost and also for user adoption.
Couldn't agree more. I would add, I think B2B content creation or content creation for B2B businesses is actually a really good use case for developing workflows like this because, again, I think I might have said at the start of the video, we're not really looking for flair or any sort of massive kind of creative input or work. I guess we're not expecting the LLM to do the heavy lift in terms of coming up with some really creative output. What we do value in this case is you can't make up technical details about fuel products for aircrafts. That's a non-negotiable. And there, I think, a number of different B2B businesses or industries where there's similar technical documentation. There's like very little leeway, but then there's a lot of opportunity to create content around that does add value. You might have subject matter experts who are able to add their own perspective on using one product over another, or maybe they might tell a
Yeah.
story about a client that used a particular product and what experience they had. So it's like you have a lot of things, maybe 80-20 is 80% is already specified. This is what you need to do. Just take this
Yeah.
SEO strategy, take these keywords, take this technical data sheet, and make sure you include these elements within the piece. And like you said, once you've specified so much and really restricted the amount that the LLM is reasoning
Yeah.
for on itself, you get to hopefully have much more predictable, scalable
Yeah.
output.
That's exactly right. And even that 20% will, eventually start to converge as the tool keeps updating the style guide. And the style guide starts to reflect more and more about what you want. And it starts to learn about, you know, successful outputs that it's produced in the past. I think you're exactly right. I think those frontier large models are best relegated to the chatbot style applications. But in this case, in fact, it might just be a good idea to show that, we're not even using a frontier model that reasons. We're actually just using a 2.5 Flash, which is, strictly a mid-sized model. So optimized for large contexts, but not very high cost and, very reasonable latency as well. So that's exactly right. We don't want the model to reason in this case. Like the only thing we actually want it to do is process all the information that we have engineered to funnel into it and just give us a reasonably reliable output back.
Love it. Okay, Arsalan. So what I will try to do now is, as a relatively non-technical person, at least out of the two of us, definitely being the least technical, let me try and sum up my understanding of what you've built here. So
Sure.
the brief, just to quickly recap, was we want to be able to produce scalable SEO optimized content for this client's website. And we already have a lot of pre-work done in the sense that we have very explicit technical data sheets for these products that we're writing these articles around, which are pretty much non-negotiable. So you already have a big chunk of the content. And then we have an SEO and content strategy that's already been predefined, which the solution is able to reference. We've also come up with certain formats for the types of content. For example, a buying guide will have a certain structure, tone of voice, all these other instructions. And then what you've done
That's
is
right.
you've created a database where all of these inputs are stored so that they can then be referenced by the AI agent that you've created within NA10. And then what
Yeah.
happens is there are different pause points or input points that you've engineered into the workflow so that the human still has an opportunity to provide input. And
Mm-hmm.
then the solution sort of checks that it has all of the information that it needs to populate all of those elements within the database that we looked at. And ultimately, at the moment, in its current form, what it does is it also takes all of that information and then creates a draft and asks for the human input, and then goes ahead and creates the final article or the article draft. And what we discussed was perhaps in version 2 of this, we may even take out the drafting node and go straight to writing the article and then get
Hmm.
the human users' input there. And then going forward, if we were to reuse this for another product and to write another article, then because you're using a database, we have memory. So it's going to retain the knowledge of the SEO strategy plus any other feedback that we've given it, which it thinks is going to improve
Yeah.
it going forward. Did I get that right?
Yeah. Yeah. Almost entirely correct. The only thing I'll add is that this isn't one agent. This is actually a multi-agent orchestration. And that also, I'll just point that out here really quickly that, the reason we've made those decisions is that in the future where, where our client will start to use this more extensively and they'll want it to be integrated into different systems, having those agents that an orchestrator calls, which then communicate to very specific endpoints. So, writing directly to Google Docs or writing to Slack, that just makes this entire solution a lot more scalable. But I'll leave those details for maybe part two or part three of this playlist.
That's a really good point. Exactly. Like somebody might be looking at this and thinking, okay, that all makes sense, but also how is a non-technical client who's not maybe comfortable with NA10, for example, supposed to be able to use this, just which pretty much looks like a terminal, right? Yeah, that's gonna be a key part of what we do going forward. I would say one more thing before, at least from my end, before we wrap this up, which is I think it's important, we've touched on it already, but it's important to recognize that while this is a pretty comprehensive workflow or let's call it a subsystem for developing SEO optimized content, there are obviously elements beyond the boundaries of this system that affect it. And we have to
Yes.
consider that whenever we're creating a workflow. I see a lot of content online around developing end-to-end workflows. What I haven't heard a lot about is what is the pre-work that's required to even make that particular workflow work, and what are the
Mm-hmm.
organizational adjustments or changes that you need to make in order to help facilitate that workflow. So in this case, for example, we needed to do a lot of thinking beforehand to come up with, firstly, a differentiation or a strategy for Avio Pro in terms of what sets them apart from other competitors in the field. And then that led to the SEO and content strategy, which we developed and verified with them, which then feeds into this workflow. That would just be one example. So that's something that we should not underestimate when we're thinking about um,
Absolutely.
creating these workflows. And then the other thing is also what is the downstream effect going to be?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yes, speed is an important lever that we can pull. Everybody talks about AI, the value of it being like how much more you can do, how much quicker, with less human input required, all of which may be true. But we have to consider how is that going to impact like parts of the, in any 10 parlance, like the next node downstream from what this work stream accomplishes. So, for example, like we already said, if we suddenly start creating 50 drafts for a human subject matter expert to review, and then 50
Yeah.
finished articles, like that's a huge workload to push on them,
Yeah.
right? So you're going to get a clog anyway,
Absolutely.
and then you're going to be like 2 months down the line, and we still haven't published much because we still have a weak link in the system.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just thought that's something worth considering. It's how we build things at Aleph.
Yeah. My goodness. We should like ask people to comment if they're interested in those kinds of stories about tech adoption in organizations and the amount of time and effort we've put into just, getting solutions across the finish line where that is the consideration. It's never a technical problem. It's a human challenge. So absolutely, I think there's so many stories just between the two of us that we can share.
Absolutely. Okay, I think what we'll do is we'll wrap this video up here. But as you rightly said, now hopefully this was a good starter for everybody to understand this particular workflow and what brief we had, what challenge we're trying to address, and then also maybe give you an insight into how we approach these challenges, what some of
Mm-hmm.
our key points of our philosophy are, things like leverage points, pause points, human in the loop. And then maybe in the next video, we can dig a little bit deeper into the individual nodes, for example, within this workflow and how you've configured them. All right. Thanks, Ursulan. Really enjoyed this first
Thanks.
video and look forward to the next one.
Yeah, likewise. Looking forward to it.